This devotion is going to be in two parts as we discuss sowing and reaping, because it was a little bit too long to include in one segment that I wanted to keep short. The scriptures in Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 and 8 read again like this: "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption. But the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." Now, every farmer knows this universal principle. One reaps that which he sows. When I was young, my grandmother purchased a property in the country. It was her dream to get out of the city and back to the area in which she grew up. And shortly after her house was built, she decided to clear a section of the land and start a garden. I was about 10 years old at that time and helped her remove the stumps and cultivate the soil. She purchased some corn seed from the local farmers co-op, and we planted that seed in rows on that particular piece of property in her garden. I was an impatient kid at the age of 10 and went out every morning after we planted the seed to see if the corn was growing. However, it seemed as if nothing was ever going to happen. Yet one day I saw something coming up from the soil. The seed had germinated, and I proceeded to watch the shoots turn into stalks, and then the ears of corn began to form. And yet it was not time for the harvest. The waiting seemed like an eternity to me. However, one day my grandmother said it was time to reap the harvest. So we pulled some of the mature ears of corn from the stalks. It was no surprise the corn seed that we'd sowed produced a huge harvest of corn. On the average, each stalk produced a couple of cobs, each loaded with about 800 kernels. Now, this is exactly the picture that Paul drew here when he wrote, "Whatever one sows, that will he also reap." This principle of sowing and reaping is universal, and it will apply to every area of life. It is vital to understand this as we consider our spiritual lives. That is our Christian walk. And so let us look at the application of this principle of sowing and reaping as it works in our lives as believers in Jesus. First, the first point is this: to reap a harvest, you must sow something. Every farmer knows this. If you do not sow seed, there will be no harvest. He who sows much will reap much, and he who sows little will reap little. And if we want our spiritual life to count for something or anything, we must do some sowing. But that leads me to the second point. What we sow makes a difference. The simple fact is this: every living being is sowing something. The question is not whether a person is sowing seed, it is what type of seed that is being sowed. Paul wrote that from a spiritual standpoint, there were two types of seed that could be sown. And let me read it to you again. "For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." There is a seed sown to the flesh and a seed sown to the Spirit. The spiritual person, the one led by the Spirit, will be characteristically sowing seed to the Spirit. But the person driven by the flesh, that is, the sinful nature, characteristically sows to the flesh. And so there's an importance to the type of seed that we're sowing. But thirdly, a person reaps of the same kind as he or she sows. It was no surprise that when we sowed corn in the field that we reaped a harvest of corn. And we didn't reap a harvest of beets or beans or anything else from that corn. We reaped a harvest of the corn seed that we planted, and it was corn itself. So it should be no surprise to us that the spiritual person who sows to the Spirit will reap spiritual blessings for all eternity, and the one who sows to the flesh will reap things of no eternal value. Paul stated it like this, again, and I'll read it. "For the one who sows to his own flesh will from the flesh reap corruption, but the one who sows to the Spirit will from the Spirit reap eternal life." The Galatians, who were following the doctrine of the false teachers, were following a doctrine contrived by the inclinations of man's sinful nature. It denied the majesty of God demonstrated by his infinite grace. Paul previously gave several examples of the things that the sinful nature would manifest in a person's life. We see that in Galatians chapter 5, and we discussed it already, verses 19 through 21. But those who are led by the flesh will manifest that which will amount to nothing profitable for eternity. Their efforts will perish with them. Yet those who sow to the Spirit will produce fruit that will remain. Now there are two more principles of sowing and reaping that I will cover in the next devotion, along with the conclusion to this. For now, let us just consider how we might sow to the Spirit rather than the flesh. For it is in this way that we will experience true spiritual riches now and throughout all eternity.